In our last discussion, we considered the idea of national identity, and we did so from the context of Canada. We considered Canadian national identity and the various forms that people see that identity taking. We also considered a vision for Canada, and we talked about various visions that have developed over time. Let's continue and add to this discussion by considering Canadian national identity from the standpoint of its promotion. Let's consider Canada's national identity and how it's been promoted. Well, in order to promote a national identity, often myths and symbols are used. Myths are sometimes stories based in some form of fact, but that have been elaborated and exaggerated upon to the point where they're not factually accurate anymore. And Canada has certainly done this. The Canadian government has continued to promote national identity by expounding and continuing to use myths in relation to the development of Canada. And the Canadian government does, at this point in time, continue to use an early myth, that of the European pioneers that settled in Western Canada and triumphed over nature and all the challenges and obstacles that were faced. And they continue to do so as part of the development of a Canadian identity, but within a context of today where perhaps 80% of Canada's population is urban and not rural. And so this identity, this idea of settling the West and triumphing over nature, it doesn't really fit completely in the current context of Canada's population. But obviously, governments and promote national identity and use, as I had mentioned, myths to do so, even when they're not completely factually accurate. They also use institutions, and institutions are used quite often to promote national identity. And so what are institutions? Well, they're basically organizations established for and they're united by a specific purpose. And the institutions themselves often use symbols and myths to promote their sense of existence or their reason for being, and to promote a sense of belonging to the institution. There are different types of institutions. One type is a cultural institution, and cultural institutions are quite often used to promote national identity, and Canada has a number of different cultural institutions that do exactly that. National Art Gallery of Canada is one example of a cultural institution that is used to promote Canada's national identity, and it's something that has done so and continues to do so. The Glenbow Museum in Calgary would be an example of one in Western Canada, in Calgary, that promotes national identity. Much of the artifacts and art pieces in the museum have to do with Canada and its own identity. Hockey Canada would be another institution, and it's very much an integral part of Canada's national identity and its promotion. We see that particularly at this period of time with the upcoming Olympics in Sochi and how important Team Canada winning the gold medal is to Canada and Canadian identity, and Hockey Canada works quite stringently at bringing that about. There's also institutions that seek to influence, and cultural institutions do that, but there are other types of institutions that also seek to influence. Aboriginal organizations, for example, such as the Assembly of First Nations or the Métis National Council, try and promote an Aboriginal perspective and try and promote and develop and support Aboriginal interests within the political context and spectrum of Canada. Polling groups and think tanks are also other institutions that seek to influence. The Ipsos Reid is a polling group, but it also polls in order to gain information and to promote a particular political agenda. The Fraser Institute, which tends to be conservative in nature, also does that. We see that within education with the Fraser Institute's listing of schools within Alberta that do quite well. There are other groups that do this. For example, when we look at economic and commercial institutions, we see groups such as labor unions, industry associations, National Chamber of Commerce of Canada, and groups, institutions that support manufacturing in Canada. All of these are economic and commercial institutions, but they also seek to influence and to promote particular interests. The Hudson's Bay Company, for example, is the oldest continuing company in the world, and it's played an important part in the development of Canadian history. It still is an important part of Canada's national identity, and as an economic institution or a commercial institution, it's obviously quite important. The National Anti-Poverty Organization, which advocates on behalf of the poor, is an example of an institution that seeks to influence, but it's also an economic institution as it tries to deal with poverty in Canada and attempts to alleviate that poverty. So let's consider specifically institutions that promote national identity. Well, let's start with some educational institutions. The Dominion Institute uses the media to educate people about Canadian history. In other words, stories are presented, or facts or historical vignettes, in order to develop an understanding about Canadian history as a means of promoting and supporting Canada's national identity. The Council of Canadians, which is Canada's largest citizens organization, has a mission to protect Canadian independence, and so it also, as an educational institution, or it seeks to educate people about the important elements of Canada and its sovereignty, and so is also an institution that seeks to influence. Let's consider some other economic institutions. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce. We did mention chambers of commerce as examples of economic and commercial institutions. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce is quite an important institution. It's an economic institution in that it represents the economic interests of businesses and industry in Canada, but it's also an institution that seeks to influence as it attempts to promote a particular objective within the parameters of its existence. How about government programs that promote national identity? There are quite a number of these as well. Arts and cultural programs, for example, that are funded both at the provincial and federal level would be examples of this. The CBC is the most well-known broadcast programs to promote Canadian identity. In fact, the CBC has a minimum standard of Canadian content, and some programs, such as Hockey Night in Canada, are particularly important in promoting and maintaining Canada's national identity. There are educational programs as well. Katimavik is an example. It's an Inuit word that means meeting place, and it refers to a federal program to educate youth through community involvement and volunteerism. The Canada World Youth, it's an educational program that deals with international intercultural exchange programs for youth, basically individuals between the ages of 17 and 24. And these individuals basically are volunteers. How about some other government programs and agencies that promote peace, order, and security, and while they do so, also in the end promote Canada's national identity? The RCMP is probably the single most visible example. You go around the world, and the RCMP is known throughout the world as one of the finest police forces in existence, and it's an important part of Canada's national identity, and it's something that's recognized as part of Canada immediately by people outside of the country. The CCRA, Canada's Customs and Revenue Agency, is a government agency, and it does attempt to promote order and security by maintaining control of Canada's borders and also collecting revenue, tax revenue. But it's also important to understand that as a government program, it also, in its efforts to collect revenue and maintain border control, also promotes national identity and national unity. How about some other economic programs and agencies? The Bank of Canada. This is an important agency, important program of the Canadian federal government. It sets currency and lending rates, which is a very important element of Canada's economy, but it also, in doing these things, creates a set of identities that are specifically Canadian, and it goes about promoting Canada's national identity as it does follow its financial and economic objectives. Federal and provincial government advertising and sponsorships for such things as Canada Day celebrations and others. And how about some individuals that promote national identity? Well, there are quite a few when we consider Canada and its history. There are many individuals, particularly in relation to sports, arts, and entertainment, that promote Canada's identity and are really tied up closely within Canada's national identity. Musicians, artists, film actors, any number of individuals. Athletes such as Wayne Gretzky, probably extremely important when it comes to promoting and maintaining national identity. In fact, Wayne Gretzky probably is closely wrapped up in Canada's national identity as the RCMP and other agencies. And there were a number of great Canadians. Tommy Douglas, who was a premier of Saskatchewan, came up with universal health care in Saskatchewan first, that then spread to the rest of Canada, and is actually seen as one of the most important and influential figures in Canada's history. Pierre Berton, who is a novelist that wrote over 70 books and a historian, wrote over 70 books in relation to Canada, is also an example of an influential figure. Don Cherry, of course, who's a hockey analyst and in Coach's Corner, is well known, widely known throughout Canada and other parts of the world, and is an example of promoting national identity. He's always speaking about how important hockey is and how important it is to Canada and how important Canadians are. So we see various elements and various ways that Canada's national identity is promoted. We see through various cultural institutions, myths, and agencies, also symbols. And so we see that in many ways the promotion of a national identity, particularly within a Canadian context, is something that's consciously thought out and is constantly followed through with.